Good morning, welcome. As you know, I'm Robert Ashby, I'm Chairman of the Board of Trustees. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Peter Atkins, who's going to be speaking to us on the subject of on-being, the limitless power of science. Peter Atkins is one of the best-known scientists in this country. He was made a Fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford in 1965 when he arrived in Oxford. As is the way with these kind of introductions, you look for sort of specious coincidences. And one of the things that happened at the same time, one of the people who arrived in Oxford at the same time was Philip Pullman, who's going to be speaking to us later on. Philip was next door in Exeter College. Up comes another specious coincidence. I was at Exeter College at the same time as Philip Pullman. Peter was one of the leading teachers of chemistry, and I went up to Exeter College to supposedly read chemistry. In fact, I didn't do much reading of chemistry, and at the end of the first year, I failed some rather boring exams and they kicked me out, and I have to stress, this had nothing to do with Peter. I'll see you about that later. Peter was Professor of Chemistry, obviously in the Department of Chemistry, until his retirement in 2007. His research was in the application of quantum mechanics, you all know and understand that, don't you, to chemical problems and theoretical aspects of magnetic resonance. But he is best known to the general public for his beautifully written and intellectually rigorous popular science books, including The Periodic Kingdom, The Second Law, Creation Revisited, and Galileo's Finger, the 10 Great Ideas of Science. His book, Molecules, was described as one of the most beautiful chemistry books ever written. I've always thought chemistry books were beautiful, but that was a really great one. This year saw the publication of a new book, On Being, a scientist's exploration of the great questions of existence. That's what Peter's going to talk to us about. Please welcome Professor Peter Atkins.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to contribute to this stimulating weekend. I have to begin with an apology. I'm a trustee of a charity in Oxford, and a long-standing engagement for that charity takes me away soon after my talk today. So I very much regret that I'm one of those people who has to go before the conference is over. I'm sure it is my loss, because there's so much of interest going on during the rest of the weekend. I'm going to talk, I'll give you a talk really based on the book that was just mentioned, and I've added the title, The Limitless Powers of Science, because I want to explore really whether there are walls around the subject or whether those walls are imaginary. Now, the scientific method emerged surprisingly late in human history, and humanity took several thousand years to stumble on the very simple and to us now somewhat obvious mode of discovery that forms its core, which is to make observations and then to compare notes. And of course, there are sophistications in both components, for science is not simply a convivial nature walk, and the observations are made on domestications of wild phenomena. They're made on cats rather than tigers. And observations can't be left to blow in the wind of uncontrolled intrusion. They must be focused and isolated. Nor can observations be merely the recitation of prejudices. They must be experiments. And the comparison of notes can't be left to idle chatter. Detailed scrutiny and assessment by expert kin is the order of the day. And sometimes, of course, through idleness of the reviewer or deception by the reviewed, error, unintended or malign, escapes the light of intense inspection, but never for long, for scrutiny is endless. Indeed, the more outlandish the claim, the more revolutionary the thought, then the more intense is the pressure that is brought to bear on its assessment. Now, there is also that extraordinary marriage between observation and mathematics. Mankind, and for some probably sociological reason, until recently has been mostly mankind, has developed a sinewy language of the utmost rigour and austerity that has proved to be the perfect tool for teasing out objectively the consequences of an imaginative, qualitative leap, or of adding spine to a whim so that it can stand up to the harshness of quantitative comparison of prediction with observation. But not all science gallops forward on the back of the grand alliance of experiment and mathematics. Darwin didn't formulate his theory of natural selection as a mathematical device, yet it has extraordinary power. His ideas have spawned aspects of the theory that have been capable of being rendered mathematical and have thereby so greatly extended its power. But at its core, natural selection is not a mathematical theory and yet does not lack power. Indeed, it's arguable that the theory of natural selection is one of the most powerful theories ever proposed. For from a simple acorn of an idea, a great forest of consequences follows. So in short, science has as its central principle the publicly shared, controlled observation that we call experiment, and where appropriate is guided, enhanced and propagated by the austerely logical rigour of mathematics. Now, so much for the scientific method itself. To what can it be applied and what are its limitations? Now, I suspect that few would disagree that science is competent when it comes to the fabrication of novel stuff and novel applications of stuff in general. That, I believe, is not really an issue to delay us. Nor shall I linger on the argument about whether those novel stuffs, including better medicines, better and more abundant foods, better fabrics, better modes of communication and transport, better modes of entertainment, and so on, weighed against the social costs, including better ways of killing, better ways of injuring our environment, and better ways of accidentally or intentionally maiming, add overall to the sum of human happiness. I'm going to focus today on the ability of the scientific method to illuminate matters of great human concern and drive out ignorance while retaining wonder. Now, I'm also aware that extrapolation from present success is not a convincing argument. I'm also aware that those who perhaps subconsciously are fearful of science's advance, and also some of our rightly cautious guardians, the more pessimistic of our reflective philosophers of science, will claim that science selects targets that have a soft underbelly, where its methods can penetrate effectively, and that it avoids topics where either subconsciously or in fact knowingly it believes its tools to be blunt. In short, some hold that it's a David that seeks out a Goliath with a limp. But why should anything remain obscure? Some argue that a phenomenon might be outside the kingdom of the physical, and over its border in the neighbouring presumed but physically inaccessible kingdom of the spirit. To those of us who believe, despite the seductive songs of sentimental sirens, that there is no such place, this argument carries little weight. We accept that there is a great deal of subjective inclination to believe that the physical is not all that there is, but as we see no objective evidence for it, but appreciate that there is a great and forceful sentimental longing for it, we cannot in all intellectual honesty accept its existence as plausible. That sentiment may be an overwhelming mental driving force, but longing is not itself an adequate proof of the existence of what is longed for. Those who promote the spirit might claim to know in their hearts that there is more to the world than the physical, but hearts are unreliable organs of knowledge. That there are billions of people who, given the chance, would vote in favour of there being more to the world than matter and radiation is also not an argument, for reliable knowledge is not secured by majority vote. Now, another component of the view that some knowledge might be forever inaccessible to the scientific method is that certain matters are private, subjective, and internal, and therefore not open to the rough and tumble outdoor brutishness of science and its emphasis on the objective and the public. But science can penetrate into people's heads and into their minds. The mode of inspection is neuroscience and its foot soldier psychology. Both may still be emerging and not yet fully reliable sciences, but they are ways to penetrate through the skull to reveal aspects of the brain's beliefs and sentiments, and indeed why they dwell there. And a third component may be that some don't want certain mysteries to be analysed objectively and dispassionately. They cherish their subjective privacy and don't want its mystery dissected, and by dissection, damaged, perhaps diminished, and even destroyed. Now, I cannot accept that ring-fencing certain delicacies in a poetic garden is a valid argument against science's ability to elucidate even the most personal. So if absolutely and unreservedly everything is an aspect of the physical material world, then I don't see how it can be closed to scientific investigation. Scientific investigation might sound clinical and inhuman in this context, something to be abhorred when applied to the tenderness of certain human concerns. But I mean open to investigation with the expectation of publicly accessible comprehension, just like any other physical phenomenon. There's one more aspect of my attitude that it would be inappropriate not to confront, that science is a flowing river of ideas. Sorry, that's my river. Which grows in grandeur and competence as tributaries bring new ideas to join its flow, with occasionally a whole new whirlpool of understanding spinning and overturning what had presumed to be secure understanding. Thus, in the physical sciences, Aristotle gave way to Galileo. Galileo gave way to Newton. Newton gave way to Einstein, and Einstein will give way to who knows. Much of scientific understanding, it is claimed, is mayfly ephemeral, awaiting further elaboration or even replacement. So how can I justifiably claim that science has power to illuminate the great questions once and for all? Well, I do and I don't. Where science reveals the organic processes accompanying birth and death, there's little force in the view that these that those observations will be overthrown. Of course, they will be elaborated, but the general details and the broad features of what is already known are objective, eternal observations, not transient theories. Where, however, science is a theoretical understanding at the edge of physics, then I fully accept that the account is likely to be changed, out of all recognition maybe, and our understanding of physical reality and cosmology will be developed and refined. But in these cases, our current theories are waypoints on the road to presumed complete understanding, not concealing that we might have far to go, yet hoping not to quench the sense of optimism that the journey will ultimately be triumphant. So in short, I stand by my claim that the scientific method is the only means of discovering the nature of reality, and although its current views are open to revision, the approach, namely making observations and comparing notes, will forever survive as the only way of acquiring reliable knowledge. Now, I shall spend a few minutes considering some of the great questions that science tackles and is starting to elucidate. And I shall consider whether there are walls that in each case it will run up against and be stopped, thwarted maybe, in its quest for understanding. For instance, our forefathers could do no more than simply lie back and think of the creation. But careful scientific investigation has displaced wondering and poetic myth by something approaching actual mechanism. And we can see how the entire universe has developed from its initial egg. How that egg was laid is still a mystery, but that initial region of ignorance should not deflect us from appreciating the broad sweep of history of the universe that science has revealed. The cosmic unfolding that has brought us from that extraordinarily pregnant moment to the present day, with an understanding that enables us to predict the general features of our future. And part of the extraordinary potency of science is its ability to take measurements on a tiny sample of the universe during a few instants of existence in a nearly microscopic region we call a laboratory region, a laboratory, over a time sometimes measured in seconds or even less, and extrapolate with considerable confidence to the universe as a whole, both in space and time. There are no doubt dangers in doing so, but science believes itself alert to them and seeks to confirm its confidence by measurements on ever greater scales of space and of time. Those who wish to protect a distinct role for religion, of course, claim that science, dealing as it does with what already exists and having no experience of what does not exist, has no dominion in the question of the origin of the universe. They would claim that science is intrinsically incapable of confronting the question, with perhaps a grudging acceptance that it might have something useful to say about the newly born universe, when a very primitive version of it is already underway, well after nothing has become something, and with the laws of nature already in place. If that view is correct, the view that such important questions are beyond the reach of the scientific method, then the only recourse would seem to be either to accept that the human brain is incapable of identifying the process of spontaneous cosmogenesis, or of accepting the existence and incomprehensible activity of some kind of creator. So I need to explore whether it's conceivable that science is not incompetent in the face of these extraordinarily interesting questions, and that some kind of agent-free answer to them about the origin of the universe in particular will in due course be forthcoming. I'm driven by my view that the driving force of science is an alliance of curiosity and optimism. The urge to answer questions and the belief that it will answer the questions it investigates. Science does not set out on its quest with the underlying presumption that understanding will not be achieved. First, it's undeniable and perhaps relevant that science has made more progress with elucidating the early moments, if not the inception of the universe, in the past 300 years than religion has made in the last 3,000. A more pungent view is that mythical accounts of the origin of the universe are actually admissions of ignorance dressed seductively in engaging allegories. They are stylish new clothes with no emperor within. And although resonances between these sometimes delightful myths and the formulation of current scientific accounts can be devised, that is perhaps because they are intrinsically vague and, like a rubber sheet, can be stretched to cover more sinewy discussions. We should be cautious, I believe, of the claims of myth makers that their allegories are prescient of scientific elucidation, for that apparent prescience is arguably a reflection only of the elasticity of allegory. Second, although science is currently seemingly stumped by the details of cosmogenesis, it's important to distinguish seemingly stumped from the actual progress of cautious advance. As an antelope might suppose that a tortoise is stationary, so it is essential to recognize the cautious tortoise advance so characteristic of science. Science is an alliance of sparkling imagination and extreme caution. Very rarely do scientists leap to a revolutionary explanation. More commonly, bridgeheads are built and consolidated before edging forward into unconquered territory. The bridgeheads are built on the consensus of theories tested against experiment, and whimsical leaps across a chasm of ignorance rarely survive. Even those great paradigmatic shifts of the 20th century, relativity and quantum theory, were built on the bridgeheads of classical physics by noting subtle deviations from its predictions. Scientists are revolutionaries, but they are conservative revolutionaries, moving cautiously into and then conquering the unknown. Now, the task before science in this particular connection will be to show how something can come from nothing without intervention. So, no one has the slightest idea whether that can happen, and if so, how it can come about. Some consider that the question of the incipience of the universe is, or some kind of mother universe from which ours has sprung, will be explained by showing that it is a consequence of the laws of physics, such as it being a quantum fluctuation of the vacuum. That, however, is inadequate as an explanation, for absolutely nothing lacks laws, just as it lacks everything else. And even a total vacuum is far richer in properties than truly absolutely nothing. There are no laws in a universe that does not yet exist, for laws come into existence as the behavior they summarize emerges with the emerging universe. Tracing our origin to a quantum fluctuation of the vacuum is perhaps appropriate for a daughter universe as distinct from a mother universe, for an existing universe does possess a richly propertied vacuum. But It is inadequate for accounting for some kind of distant ancestor universe. For nothing, which presumably preceded this universe, has no properties, and thus does not undergo quantum fluctuation. Now, the unfolding of absolutely nothing into something is a problem of the profoundest difficulty and currently far beyond the reach of science. It is, however, a target at which science must aim, even though to some, even to scientists of a pessimistic or perhaps just realistic bent, it would seem to be forever out of science's reach. But in some way or another, science has to show that everything, including nothing, is within science's reach, and that science provides the prospect of understanding even the most stupendous of phenomena, the coming into existence of a universe from nothing. Now, I certainly don't want to give the impression that anyone has a clue about the nature of nothing and it's turning itself into something. But science is not overawed by grandeur, nor does it accept appearances without deeper investigation. That investigation often reveals a deeper simplicity and thus encourages the thought that there might be an answer after all. We scientists, I like to think, are hewers of simplicity out of complexity. Now, I shall illustrate that idea by asking whether very much has come into existence initially. For example, there's a bit of the universe, not all of it, of course. For instance, as a simple example, we should recognize that although there are electrical charges in the universe, positive charge, negative charge, the total electric charge of the universe is zero. We know that because, for otherwise, the enormous strength of the interaction between unbalanced electrical charges would have blasted the universe apart as soon as it had been formed. Presumably before the creation, when there was nothing, there was no charge. So the coming into being of the universe was accompanied by the separation of no charge into its opposites, positive and negative charges. Charge was not created at the creation. Electrical nothing separated into equal and opposite charges. So this electrical creation event was not the manufacture of electric charge, it was the separation of opposites. At the creation, nothing did indeed come from nothing, but the original nothing was turned into a much more interesting and potent current nothing when some kind of event split nothing into its electrical opposites. So one can play with words in this game. And there is, as you're all aware, a great deal of energy in the universe. Galaxies of burning stars, spinning and orbiting planets, flying balls. Here at least, something, energy, seems to have come from nothing. Now we can actually take a measure of God's initial munificence by estimating the total amount of energy currently present. And because energy is conserved, that is, it doesn't change, how much energy there has been for all time and how much he trusted us with for all our futures. We can do that by noting that mass is a measure of the energy trapped in a localized entity. So the famous equation E equals mc squared, relating the mass of a region to the energy localized there, is a way of interpreting mass as energy. So to measure the total energy in the universe, we simply weigh it and take the weight of the universe, the mass of the universe, and multiply it by c squared. And we've got the total energy of the universe. And clearly, If we did that for one galaxy, we get quite a lot of energy. Do it for another galaxy, even more energy, and so on. And the amount of energy in the universe from the mass of the galaxies multiplied by the square of the speed of light is enormous, awe-inspiringly audience. And clearly God had a job to do on day dot. But there's another contribution to the total energy that I've ignored so far, which is the energy due to the gravitational attraction between galaxies. Whenever two masses interact gravitationally, their energy is lowered. Okay? In particular, it lowers the energy of the stars within a galaxy, which clump together under its influence, and it lowers the energy of the galaxies themselves because they attract each other over nearly infinite space. This gravitational attraction between the galaxies lowers the energy, and current indications are that it lowers that original energy down to zero. Now, no one actually knows whether the total of all the contributions to the energy of the universe is in fact exactly zero. But the near cancellation of the positive contribution of the bound up in the mass of the galaxies by the negative contribution, the gravitational attraction between them, is indeed highly suggestive. Indeed, if we now know that there's a kind of matter, dark matter, with wholly unknown properties, except its ability to interact gravitationally with common matter, and which, when included in the sum, brings complete cancellation much closer. Dark matter is actually highly confusing, and its existence particularly humiliating. For although it seems that it's far more abundant than common matter, we know nothing about it except a little about its distribution in the universe, and have been unable to detect it except by its inferred effect on the formation, structure, and properties of galaxies. So the bottom line, prejudiced with a dash of speculation, is that the initial endowment of energy at the creation, God's munificent gift to mankind, was exactly zero. And the total energy has remained fixed at that value for all time, and there will never be any energy in the universe. Now, I took you through those slightly technical considerations because it's easy to be overwhelmed by the thought of what had to happen at the creation. Now, the separation of nothing into opposites still needs explanation, but it seems to me that such a process, although awesome, is less overwhelmingly awesome than the process of positive, specific, munificent creation. The latter raises the question about, for instance, where all the energy came from in the first place. The former diminishes the task of explanation because it reveals that no energy had to be created. Science identifies the true questions while leaving the sense of awe intact and allows progress with the search for real answers. On the left, before the creation, on the right, after the creation, not much had to be done. Now, our forefathers could do no more than simply lie back and think of the biosphere. But careful scientific investigation has displaced our total ignorance about the origin of organisms, an ignorance that inspired myths in almost every culture, by a single principle that, although difficult to apply, seems to have the potency to account for all living species, past and present. Now, there remains ignorance about the original egg. How did the inorganic first stumble into becoming the organic? But even here, science has not been stumped. It's alive with its ideas, but does not yet have sufficient evidence to identify which of them, if any of them, is correct. What happily happened here can happen anywhere with similarly benign and stable conditions. And it's not an unreasonable supposition that the universe teems with life that has stumbled into being and has evolved by natural selection. This is extrapolation of another kind, and extraordinarily difficult to test, for so great are the chances for information to travel from likely candidate worlds, and certainly from galaxy to galaxy, that what was once alive might well have burned out or has yet to come into being. We might never know. We too might be burned out before the bottle washes up on our shore. Now, there is one extraordinary property of the biosphere that is of the profoundest difficulty and deepest fascination. It's the fact that the biosphere knows itself. I speak, of course, of consciousness. Can the scientific method ever hope to elucidate this extraordinary property, or is it only within us, with a profound irony, in fact, that we encounter the impassable brick wall that science cannot penetrate? Is it our own conscious ability that has been the enabler of science that will forever remain beyond scientific elucidation? I think not. Then I would, wouldn't I? I am, of course, aware that philosophers have long grappled with this very question and are, to say the least, pessimistic that this amazing property of matter can ever be explained in a manner that we can comprehend, and have resorted to a variety of excuses, including the denial that it is a property of matter, or somehow that it transcends substance. But philosophers are professional pessimists, so it would not be surprising that they adopt this defeatist view. Scientists are, or should be, optimists. Few of them embark on a voyage of discovery with the expectation that it will not be successful. It is perhaps quite right for philosophers to act as millstones around the necks of scientists, to prevent them from dashing off over intellectual precipices by unwarranted extrapolations. But they should realize that that is their role, and that they are not revealers of truth. Truth comes from experiment, in alliance with imagination, introspection, and mathematics. It doesn't come from introspection alone. The key point in the matter of consciousness is that it's a property of matter. It's no different in principle from the wetness of water and the pungency of ammonia. As such, it is open to scientific elucidation. There will not, of course, be a single formula or even verbally expressed law that summarizes this exquisite property. There will, I suspect, be two aspects of its elucidation, both of which are currently showing signs of success. One will be the physical disentanglement of the neuronal structure of brains, such as has already been successful with shrimps and in due course will be successful with humans. We now have the tools, such as a functional MRI, to penetrate the barrier between the external and the personal, to penetrate the skull, to monitor the functions of zones of the brain, and can expect this ultimate invasion of our privacy to become ever more refined. The other approach to the problem of consciousness will be to simulate it. Advances in computation are already bearing fruit in this matter, and I see no reason to suppose that some kind of computer, not necessarily a digital computer, will one day be turned on and consider itself to be a self. The question that might then occupy philosophers and scientists for 1,000 years is whether that artificial consciousness is the same as our own, Of course, another danger, is that the simulated consciousness will be so smart that we don't understand its output and dejectedly turn it off as a failure. But if it's that smart, though, it might turn us off first. Our forefathers could do no more than simply lie back and think of reproduction, or of England at least, the centerpiece of life. But careful scientific investigation has displaced our complete ignorance of what goes on between conception and the risky process of parturition. We should not lose sight in this regard of the alliance of simplicity and complexity that nature has adopted to ensure the effective immortality of an organism by periodic replication of the vessel carrying its genes. The simplicity lies in the encoding of the information for the preparation of good approximations to self. Whereas literature uses over 24 symbols to express itself, the whole of the biosphere is encoded in just 4. Now, the price that nature has to pay for this simplicity is the complexity of mining the DNA and converting information into organism. Both the simplicity and complexity have been unraveled by the fingers and brains of imaginative scientists, and we now think that we know the full story of what takes place in pregnancy. Our forefathers could do no more than simply lie back and think fearfully of death, the unavoidable sequel to life, and to ameliorate its prospect, built myth upon myth. But careful scientific investigation has revealed what lies in store for all of us, like it or not. There's no comfort here, but science is not about false comfort, it's about truth. Truth is a part of the spirituality of my kind of positive disbelief, for it gives us confidence to employ what talents we have, and if not talents, then opportunities. It urges us to use and not to waste the time when we're present on earth, not unthinkingly to seize the day, but by judiciously enjoying our brief interlude of consciousness, the flicker of daylight between darkness of the cradle and the darkness of the grave, for some to comprehend, for others simply to indulge. Science has contributed gloriously to death by furnishing methods to keep it at bay or to ameliorate the painful sharpness of the teeth in its jaws when finally it visits. Medicine is one of science's great contributions to human well-being, with health arguably more important than education, for it is perhaps better to be alive and ignorant than dead but informed. Our forefathers could do no more than simply lie back and think hopefully of what follows death, and in the absence of any evidence, indeed in the light of the impossibility of acquiring evidence, built engaging myths about the variety of comeuppances and rewards that lie in store. And here science proceeds in 2 strands. It's reasonably secure in the vision when it stands on the edge of the future and peers into the forward abysm of time and sees the end of the world. We can be confident about the middle-term future history of the solar system, which will see the end of all our material, intellectual, and artistic, and indeed scientific achievements. The very long-term future is less certain, as it might be the case that unknown principles will come into play and protect us somehow from the current expectation that all there will be is dead, flat space-time. For those secure in the belief that there is life of some kind to come, science might on this question seem to overreach itself and bumble in where it is incompetent to tread. Thus, soul slips from its grasp, and science, being grounded in the pre-afterlife, they say, cannot illuminate the afterlife itself. Quite frankly, it's hard to credit that extraordinary property of complexly interacting matter that we call consciousness can survive the decomposition of that matter. Science, especially through psychology, shines its brilliant light on the afterlife, and instead of illuminating it, causes it to shrivel and die, revealing its real core, namely anxiety. Now, it's commonly held that science's awesomely sharp blade is blunt when it comes to slicing through the fabric of the heaven and leaves uncut the nature of the soul. Is the soul forever to be beyond the reach of science? The answer depends entirely on what you mean by soul. If by soul you mean a flimsy spiritual affair that has the prospect of immortality and wanders off from its earthly anchor when death applies its sting, then science can as good as deny any prospect of its existence. As I've emphasized, the spine of the scientific method is publicly shared evidence, not the wishful thinking of private longing. Public experiment rules, not private sentiment. In the present case, the message from science is starkly simple and hardly needs to be said. There is no evidence for life after death, and it is contrary to our understanding of what constitutes life to suppose that it exists in any sense at all. But immortality is achievable, be it Mozart through music, Newton through physics, and Tutankhamun through tourism. But in every case, it's an immortality of the footprint left in the course of a life, not immortality of a physical body or spiritual soul. Science elucidates this aspect of the soul by tracing it to anxiety, the anxiety of individuals who cannot come to terms with the prospect of their own annihilation. As usual, I have to acknowledge the normal defense erected by those determined to believe that there is an afterlife, that science has gathered its experiences on this side of the grave and supposes only falsely that its gaze pierces through the iron curtain of death and can comment on the world beyond. How can we be sure, they ask? Or more strongly, how can we have the arrogance to suppose that knowledge acquired in the laboratories of the living has any relevance to the realm of the dead? Such a view would be powerful if there were any evidence for the afterlife. It loses its potency completely in the absence of any. Even if instead by soul you mean the flimsy wisp of potential immortality that sprang into existence when lucky sperm penetrated lucky ovum. If you don't mean that, but you do mean the driving power of human creativity and the capacity to love, then science is still not silent. Now it calls on psychology and anthropology and sends them forward into battle. With their aid, it can elucidate, in my view, love, hope, and charity. It can also elucidate those great inspirations to human achievement, the 7 deadly sins of pride, envy, anger, greed, sloth, gluttony, and lust. Now, our forefathers could do no more than simply lie back and respond to authority. Does science run up against a wall when it confronts human behavior? Is ethics outside its domain? Is there indeed a second inaccessible magisterium where its writ does not run? I consider not. The fundamental choice when we consider the roots of ethics and all its ramifications is whether we should seek the authority of ancient texts or seek, instead, to understand the origins of our behaviour. I don't dismiss Holy Writ as wholly inappropriate to our deportment within our societies. The anecdotes and musings the Bible and the Quran contain are the distillation of ancient wisdom and experience, and clues to appropriate behaviour in certain circumstances might be found there by those who are tossed on the choppy seas of daily life and need a lighthouse for guidance and survival. But it is far better, I think, to understand the roots of human behaviour. Here science can contribute, and thus contribute to ethics, and help to elucidate the distinction between good and bad, propriety and impropriety, right and wrong, saintliness and evil. And the roots of human behaviour are twofold. The infrastructure of our behaviour, the skeleton that underlies the enfleshment of decisions, is our evolutionary history. Struggles, both unconscious and conscious, have left an indelible mark on our psyche and provide the foundation for human behaviour. I don't pretend to be able to trace the trail from red in tooth and claw, or from something less dramatic, such as the efficacy of its sloppy protoplasm in the case of an amoeba, to the largely but not wholly respectable and sensible Ten Commandments and our intrinsic sense of good behaviour. All I want to do is to argue that the trail is open to scientific elucidation and not outside the limits of science. Our ethological history, en route from 1 to 1 trillion cells, is only a part of the story. To that ethical infrastructure is added our ability to reflect on the consequences of our actions. Red teeth and claws became coated in the milk of human kindness by the capacity of our brains, our big brains, to foresee, at least within a small compass, the consequences of our actions. Once again, I don't claim that the modulation of the infrastructure by the intellect is fully understood. All I'm saying is that it is open to scientific analysis, and that an understanding of the distinction between wickedness and saintliness does not lie beyond the grasp of science. And what of religious belief? Here the argument is raised that because religion deals with the immaterial subjective, and science's arena is the material objective, then there is no overlap between magisteria. Thus, it is argued, the undoubted success that science has in its domain is wholly irrelevant to questions that lie in religions. Such an argument might be unassailable were it not for a conceivably false premise. That premise is that there is an immaterial subjective world, or world of concepts, that does not spring from the material. If, as I've argued earlier, all there is in terms of actual events and beliefs about possible events springs from the material brain, then science can reach into the world that religion protests is peculiarly its own. You might disagree that religious belief springs from the material structure of the human brain, augmented, of course, by cultural conditioning and all kinds of personal angst, and find the claim repugnant that the inexpressible joy you experience in what you consider to be the presence of the grace of God is nothing but an illusion, even incipient madness. Nevertheless, it is almost certainly true, and whether or not it is true is open to scientific investigation using the panoply of techniques that are becoming available to us. In short, religious belief is open to psychological investigation, and thus, within the arena, open to science. Let me conclude, really. My own faith, my scientific faith, is that there is nothing that the scientific method cannot illuminate and elucidate. Its revelation and insights add immeasurably to the pleasure of being alive. My faith respects the powerful ability of the collective human intelligence, which initially groped for understanding through myth, but now gives us the capacity to comprehend and, optimistically, given time and given cooperation between brains, will do so without limit. The scientific method is, in my view, a distillation of common sense in alliance with honesty, and its discoveries illuminate the world. Unlike myth-making, which is entertainment in alliance with the desperation of sought but thwarted understanding, that illumination is the sound and firm foundation for the joy of true comprehension. There are no limits to science. Thank you very much.
Wow. I think that Peter has presented a flow of stimulating ideas on the creativity of science, but presented it with poetry and wit. Thank you very much. I think as a review of where science is, what is achieved, that has given us a real baseline for our discussions this weekend. Peter is happy to answer questions for the next quarter of an hour or so. Yeah. Whether you can answer them. I'm sure you'll answer them as well as anybody might be able to. I think we've only got one of these, I think, haven't we? Have we got a roving mic? Can we get the roving mic out? Is somebody going to take it to members of the audience? Will you do that? Yeah, okay. But as we've only got one of these, Peter, do you mind selecting the people you're going to take questions from yourself? Okay, at the back on the left.
Hi, Professor Atkins. Thank you for your talk. I would just like to challenge you on one point, if I may. You argue that the reason people believe in the afterlife is due to their anxieties about death. If that were true, then we would expect to see a positive correlation between death anxiety and belief in the afterlife. People who are most anxious about death would believe in the afterlife most strongly. However, we don't find that relationship. In fact, we don't find any relationship at all. I think the reason that we believe in the afterlife is because it's impossible to simulate our own psychological non-existence. Asking what it's like to be dead is a bit like asking what's it like to be a rock. There's no conscious experience of what it's like to be a rock, just as there is no conscious experience of what it's like to be dead. And so it's our natural mind design, if you like, to believe in the afterlife. It's not really anything to do with death anxiety, although that may keep our belief going, but it doesn't cause it in the first place.
Well, that's very interesting. I'm surprised that there is such evidence, because I actually would intuitively believe, and it's no stronger than that people are afraid of their own annihilation and that they find it difficult to come to terms with not being around. So I'm surprised at that evidence, and I'm not sure that I really truly believe it, but if it is evidence, then from what I said earlier in my talk, I have to accept it, which I find discomforting. But I'm not sure that I also agree with your suggestion that you can't understand can't contemplate what it's like to be dead. I think I can. I think I can certainly, having experienced the unconsciousness of anesthesia, can reproduce that in my mind, I think. So I really would dispute that suggestion. Be interesting, I mean, to study what people's various conceptions of being dead might be.
My name is Nayan Rakwe. Thank you very much, Professor, for that most erudite and fascinating talk. Thank you very much indeed. Now, you mentioned right in the beginning of your talk about neuroscience and psychology, and you showed that slide of the open brain. In anatomy, in the first year, we were taught that there were, in the brain, silent areas. And we called them silent areas because we did not know what they subserved. And I am convinced that once we can open the portals, and of course, you already showed the MRI scans that we are doing now to open these silent areas, we will answer many of the questions that we now say to God or spirituality or etc., soul, which really will have a scientific basis. Because there is so much more that we still do not understand. And as Shakespeare's Hamlet says, there are more things in earth and heaven, Horatio, than are dreamt of in our philosophy. So I am convinced that we really, as scientists, should be optimistic that there are no limits to our science, and we will answer all these questions once those silent areas are revealed.
Well, I can't disagree with that, of course, since it's my own view as well. But clearly, silent areas correspond to ancient maps with dragons on, and it's just a matter of discovering what they do.
Hi. I'd like to bring into question what you said at the end about your faith in science. Because whilst it may be within the realm of science to address all physical matters, it may not be within the capability of conscious beings to perform an experiment on something. So, for example, it might take more energy in the universe or more energy than we had accessible to us to do an experiment on something, or more computational time than we could ever conceivably have. So I would say that that's a quite distinct limit on science.
Well, yeah, the spring of your question is string theory, and isn't it? And sort of, anyway, the sense that we're beginning to develop a theory which might never be testable. But I don't think the presumption that it is untestable is any longer thought to be valid. I mean, there are implications of string theory that one can test in a laboratory. I mean, just to make it as simple as possible, you might say that it predicts the mass of an electron, so you can go out and measure the mass of the electron. You don't actually have to do all the experiments that it stimulates. Yeah,
but there could be something that we don't know, not within that, like not within string theory. There could be an unexperimentally performable experiment.
Yeah, but don't talk too much like a philosopher. Scientists are forever, they're explorers pressing the frontiers of knowledge everywhere. And so they go out looking for inconsistencies, and you get Nobel Prizes by interpreting inconsistencies, not by confirming conventionalities. So provided science goes on being funded, and provided scientists don't get bored with discovering nothing, then they will go on pressing for ignorance, to overcome ignorance.
Thank you. Also, I'd like to record appreciation of your talk. Very, very interesting. One area, though, I slightly worries me, though, is whether we could sort of slip into the sort of arrogance we had at the end of the 19th century when everyone thought, we're more or less there. And would you agree that one potential limit is the capability of a brain that was evolved to live on the savannah in Africa?
I mean, one can turn that round. It's quite extraordinary that the brain that did evolve to survive is capable, it seems, of seemingly limitless understanding. Achieving comprehension might be very slow for our brains, but we seem to be able to get there. There is always the possibility that individually we won't be able to understand the answers that will be forthcoming. But currently it's just pessimism to inspire the thought that we won't get there. Let's go on trying to get there for as long as we can. And the other point to make is that these days it's the collective human brain which is so important to making discoveries, not just individuals. And it may be that some kind of collective, because everyone is communicating and so on, it may be that the collective human brain will be a much more powerful instrument than an individual brain. And the other final thought is that, okay, build a machine that is really super intelligent, and perhaps it will understand it, even though we don't. Be depressing.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful survey of where we are now. I was particularly interested in what you came to at the end, understanding the mechanics of human needs, requirements, social needs and requirements, how we deal with that, knowing that we have got to be able to persuade people to understand what you're talking about science and to deal with their needs. And more we are beginning to take that on board, and I think that's a very important step for science to take, to move into the social and the psychological and the understanding of the mechanics of how people express their needs.
And it's a role for this
Yes.
association.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned towards the end of your talk collective human intelligence. Could you not argue that one of the limits of science is collective human stupidity?
Collective stupidity. Yeah, I'm afraid so. But at least science will enable us to understand it.
I accept you're right to start with, and I think it was a wonderful talk. My name's Josh Kuczynski, by the way. What I would like to know is a question of classification in some way. I'm thinking of some of the people you mentioned, say Mozart, and creative artists who engage with the world. Are scientists at a meta level artists? Are artists at another level engaging in exploring the world and in some ways defining the world? Or are they just providing entertainment?
I think, well, clearly artists do provide entertainment, but I think they are subjects to investigate. So I think that science can explore the nature of artistic creativity. I see no reason why it should not develop an understanding of aesthetics.
I agree, but are the artists themselves engaged in some form of important exploration of the world? They're observers of the world that need us to interpret. I mean, that's really arrogant, but right.
But
Well,
there's some truths you can't escape.
I've changed my opinion. I think I don't agree with everything that you say.
I think, can we take one from somebody who's not a trustee? Hang on.
Thank you. My name is Ian Dunbar. If counterfactually the divine creation theory were true of the universe, would you then think there would be limits to science in that universe?
Yes.
You don't have anything to say about that, do you?
No, I think science is all about agent-free process. And so if there is something that is somehow outside space and outside time, whatever that means, then that would be outside science's domain. Yeah. But we have to look for any evidence for it, and currently there is none.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for answering those questions. I think what we have learned is that there is no dimension that science cannot address. let's thank Peter in the traditional way for both his talk and also answering our questions this morning.